Hey there, Banditos. It's that time of week again where we fling open the doors of our local comic book shop and discuss comic book creators, artists, publishers, what have you. You're listening to the latest and greatest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this February 8th. I am Joe Marcello.
I am Mike Farah.
And our buddy Oren can't be with us tonight. However, we are going to soldier forth like we always do. And we are going to bring you another, get ready for this, guys, another episode of Mike on the Mic. That's right. It's another All Mike episode. And we're bringing Mike's interview with Gene Ha. Gene is a fabulous artist, was real big in the 90s, worked on a fair amount of X-Men. And I have to say, this is a really interesting interview. I didn't know much about him prior to it. Mike did a great job.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the compliments. Gene was a fabulous guest. It was great to talk to him about, his earliest work where I first discovered him, like The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. And then he's just one of those artists that has kept getting better and better and better over time. And, hit a very big high point with Top 10, one of Alan Moore's America's Best Comics titles. And then really hit it out of the park with his own creation called May, M-A-E, which continues to be published here and there, depending on how Gene fits it into his schedule at Dark Horse. And plenty of other work going on as well, as you'll hear. So let's get to it. This is Gene Ha. Gene, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here too.
Great. We are going to start off our conversation with the same question we usually ask of all artists and writers, and that is, what's that?
Oh, I said, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, so this is the question we ask all our artists and writers that are on the show, and that is, how did you discover comics?
So I was born in 1969. I was a little kid in the 70s. So I got to see the wire racks in drugstores and convenience stores that said, "Hey kids, comics," with piles of cheap bendable comics there to get you to stop screaming at your parents if they just blew like 25 cents or 35 cents or such. So and I loved them so much. It was a time before CGI graphics and such. So if you wanted to see something fantastical like Colossus, a person with metal skin that's perfectly reflective or something like that, the only place you could see a visual story of that was in comics. There's no other way to do it well.
That is very true. I can't imagine up until this point where we can put it on an animation or, CGI. Comics was it. This was the format for showing things fantastical. Do you have any of those original comics that you picked up on the spinner racks?
No. When I went off to college, I had two brothers, and when I went off to college, I left my long boxes behind, and there were communally owned comics by all three brothers. We didn't really distinguish. And my younger brother, at some point while I was away at college, decided he was going to sell off our communal ownings and take all the money, which there was no rule against it. We hadn't set it up. So it's just like, I came back and the comics were gone.
But he didn't share it with you or your brother, the proceeds?
No. Well, I mean, I am a pampered trust fund baby. My dad paid my way through college. So it's not like I can complain, oh, I had no money because he sold off the comics. So, but there was a lot of treasured comics that I've been slowly rebuying over the decades.
Great. So you broke into the industry. From what I read, your first published comic book issue was a Green Lantern issue.
Yes. Oh, yes.
We talked to a lot of creators whose first published work are in indies or small press publishers. You got right in there with DC. What was that like?
It was one of the easiest breaking into comics I've ever heard of, where I drew up some samples in my senior year of art school. Then you sent off the photocopies to Marvel and or DC, and I decided, just as my backup plan, I'd send them off to DC. And Marvel got back with a form letter describing with a list of all the faults you could have, and they were checked off. all of them except one, which they probably should have checked off too, which was storytelling, which still needed some work. And then they wrote some notes on the bottom of that explaining, and here's some extra faults we hadn't thought of when we made the list that you also have. And so essentially a pretty harsh rejection on some pretty crappy photocopied form letter. But I was lucky that Neil Posner was the submissions editor at DC. And he liked my samples enough to say, I'm paraphrasing here, you're not good enough to work for DC yet, but please send in more samples. And over the next few months, like he did with a lot of other very famous artists, he mentored me on what I needed to improve to get a job at DC until I was ready a few months later. Yeah, and like you said, I know so many people who I got one rejection letter to break into the comics and and I know so many people who, again, went through various indie comics publishers, doing whole issues, not getting paid, getting 30, 40 rejection letters over the course of a few years. And I was just like, again, pampered baby. So I got my first letter from Marvel, moped for 3 days, lying on the couch way too much. And then I got my letter from DC saying more samples. And I was like, oh, okay. So, that was as hard as it got for me.
1 out of 2 ain't bad.
Yeah.
But then you started doing more and more work there at DC and eventually also at Marvel. And one of your first, multi-issue arcs or miniseries in this case was the Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix.
Yes.
Yes. And this was early mid-90s, right?
Yeah.
It really, the X books were the pinnacle of comics at that point. And, how did it feel to get this assignment in the middle of what is probably the most popular, I want to say uprising, but popular books in the most popular era?
Yeah, it's hard to describe like anything in the modern comics landscape that was as dominant as the X-Men were back then. They dominated like most of the top 10 selling comics in the United States at the time. They were selling, in a few cases, 1 million copies an issue and such. Jim Lee still is a superstar. So when the editor of the X-Men line, not of Marvel Comics in general, but the editor of the Marvel group called me on the phone out of the blue, I didn't believe it was really him, but I had to pretend it was just in case. So fortunately, it really was him. And fortunately, I didn't just tell him to F off or something like that. So, and then that's how I got my first gig with X-Men, which was X-Men Annual number 3, Storm going bad girl again. Let me see. And then I had her floating in the air wearing a short skirt, but you couldn't see anything up her skirt. But that was still considered so scandalous. They made a rule. Nobody can put a upshot of a short skirt, even if you don't show anything.
Wow.
And they still gave me more work.
So that is, do they refer to that as the Gene Ha rule?
I'll say it was kind of short-lived, but I mean, it was kind of a weird time for my generation of comic book artists trying to figure out how we're going to represent women. Because I remember there's this thing where this growing trend of nipple bumps. We really wanted to draw women with nipple bumps. We never drew men with nipple bumps, which I mean, when I wear a t-shirt, you can see my nipples, but I never draw that.
I mean, on the male side, they did set the precedent in the Clooney movie with Batman and Robin. I mean, those suits had nipples on them.
Oh yeah, I had a friend at the Alternative Weekly paper when I was living in Bloomington, Indiana, who did a comic strip about that, where it was talking about how Batman needs to have, his batarangs and all this and this and that, and his bat nipples in case he needs to suckle Robin.
Oh boy, I didn't know we were going to get into such nipple conversation in this interview, but you never know.
I did also, back to the 90s, rewatched some Ren and Stimpy lately, where they're the episode where they're rubber nipple salesmen.
Oh, there you go. It's all coming up nipples, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's pivot back though to the subject at hand here.
Yeah.
Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. So you had some, a little bit of X-Men under your belt. You get this big arc where basically explaining, if not the origins of Cable, the very beginnings of his life in the future.
Oh yeah.
And
There's
this is a big character, right? That especially at that time, sort of mysterious, and everybody wanted to know about. So this must have been a really, big project.
yeah. I got to work with the whole team at the X-Men editorial office. So specifically, Bob Harris and Lisa Patrick, who was brilliant but left comics, and also Scott Lobdell, who was determined not to do what everyone expected, which was Sentinels on the Beach for the honeymoon of Cyclops and Phoenix. And also, there's a big mission with that comics, with that miniseries, to repair the parental relationship between Scott Summers and the child he abandoned to the future, who then turned out really badly, and maybe shouldn't have figure out a way not to abandon him in the future. So to repair Scott Summers' soul, they sent him and Jean Grey to the future so he could actually raise the kid and save him from becoming a horrible, I can't remember his name right now, the evil twin of Cable. That's horrible, I forgot his name, but yeah. Strife, right, Strife with a Y. Yeah, so that he would not end up as two evil twins instead, so there'd only be one evil twin.
Yes. When it comes to evil, I suppose one is better than two.
Yeah.
And
it was a brilliant way of doing it. What's that?
No, go ahead.
Oh, it's a brilliant way of doing it because it was not what everyone was expecting. I remember like a parody of what they expected the issue to what happened that issue inside of an Image comic from the time. It's probably Wildcats or something, where they had a big fight of the Wildcats at a beach resort, and then they had Scott and Jean on their honeymoon on the beach watching the fight.
Better to show their parental skills than them just kind of sitting back and.
I mean, everyone was expecting essentially modern day, everyone wearing tights and just, more mutants fighting mutants, or mutants fighting mutant killing robots or something like that. And we went in a totally different direction. Far future. And also at the time, it still is true. The cool dystopic future was Blade Runner. So everyone was drawing the future as Blade Runner. And we went in a different direction because it's supposed to be like, I can't remember, 2,000-3,000 years in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of figured everybody wouldn't be wearing trench coats at that point and, mirror shades. So me and Scott Lobdell had some fun with that.
Although fashion does come in cycles. You never know by 3,000 years if that comes back to fashion.
Yeah, maybe.
Were you, so knowing this and knowing, that sort of direction, were you excited by that? Or were you like, oh man, I don't get to draw, sort of the classic X-Men suits and everything like that?
When I get the chance to draw a future, what's exciting for it is to build the universe. Well, it's not the only exciting thing, but I mean, when you start off, the exciting thing is building the universe and giving it its own internal logic that gives you story possibilities that wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't thought it through. And by making the future that much weirder and different, and just like, again, not people in trench coats with mirror shades, walking between skyscrapers with floating taxi, essentially by getting away from Blade Runner, which is like, I really love. It gave us story possibilities that were expanded the X universe.
And you got to do it again, right? A couple of years later, there was a sequel, Ascani-san.
Right. The teen years.
The teen years, yeah. So what were you looking forward to, or what did you want to bring to that project in terms of continuing the story from the first?
Oh man. There's so much fantastic technology in the X-Men universe right from the beginning. I mean, just immediately when you start off with Kirby and Stan Lee, where like you have flying vehicles, even when people don't have magneto-magnetic powers, and intelligent androids. I mean, like the Sentinels came within a few years of the first issue of X-Men and stuff like that. You have, and when all these technologies have been around for 10, 15, 20 years, and then you go 3,000 years in the future, what does that future look like? and it's going to be really strange. And I was playing around with ideas like, I mean, if in the year 1995 you have Dependable Flying Vehicles by Reed Richards, 2,000, 3,000 years in the future, that's going to be really commonplace. So I had buildings with dependable floating technology, which, you know, that's been all over the place before, but also sections of the buildings are going to be floating dependably and safely. And the buildings could assemble and reassemble and disassemble, or float around. Bits of a building could float around other parts of the building, and you'll see it just like there's these sections of buildings just floating in a ring around a building because it's rearranging itself. It just, the X Office gave me a huge amount of freedom to just play with this stuff. And not sure if everyone the other artists and writers who followed necessarily understood everything we were doing with that future, because I think a lot of it didn't really get used that often. But it's still there if somebody wants to play with it.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, considering how much they are always bringing back pieces from alternate timelines or various futures, you never know, they could bring that back too. I like the idea of this sort of modularity of the architecture.
Yeah, I mean, everything. There's just I could just play around with this. It was a wacky science fiction future, which there's nothing quite like even today. So I gotta say, I'm very curious if they ever do an X-Men movie focused on Cable's youth, if they're going to use anything we did, or if it's going to look like Blade Runner or Terminator or something like that, which is kind of what I'm expecting, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's a good question. And things tend to sort of flatten into a, you know, homogeneous kind of future look.
Yeah.
Well, we could cross our fingers. You know, they'll get to it. They're getting to just about everything. So yeah. Cable can't be too far behind the teenage years and the kid years. So you know, post these couple of projects, or even during them, you had you know, a number of projects through with DC and Dark Horse in that late 90s period. What do you remember about that? Were there any sort of overlooked gems or hidden gems maybe that you would highlight from that period?
There's a short story I'm very, very proud of. I'm going to go into one is the most important. After I broke in with Neil Posner helping mentor me through that, the next biggest mentoring phase for me was getting a chance to work with Archie Goodwin and drawing a short story with him. It's in Showcase 95, so 1995, issue number 11. And it's the non-cover story. It's a Batman Arkham Asylum story about a psychiatrist who thinks he's smart enough to mess with the minds of the inmates, the patients of Arkham Asylum. And it does not go well for him. And visually, it's one of the stories I'm most proud of having drawn. And also, Archie Goodwin was a story genius and also one of the sweetest guys in comics ever. Just having him as an editor was just like this huge blessing to the whole industry. So that is a story I'm really proud of. There's also a person I adore, but who is not the sweetest guy in comics or science fiction. Oh man, I am the worst person with names sometimes. The writer of A Boy and His Dog and the Dream Corridor.
But you have competition for worst with names because
short science fiction author who's famous for being willing to punch people. He's kind of Wolverine personified, grew up in Cleveland. It's like every detail in my head. But anyway, I got to work on his Dream Corridor story anthology, which the short story, The Silver Corridor, which got adapted by Mark Waid. So that was my first chance to work with Mark Waid. And I was also very, very proud of how that story came out. But the funny thing is, it's so close in my head to
Harlan Ellison.
I'm going to Google his name really fast on my phone.
Harlan Ellison.
Harlan Ellison, yes. Okay, yeah, Harlan Ellis. Me and Mark were super happy with how the story came out. Really had fun playing with the visuals. And then we just had to wait for Harlan Ellison to write an introduction to that issue for the issue to come out.
And how long did that take?
Over 10 years. That's all the issue was waiting for, just his one-page introduction.
Really, 10 years?
Yes.
And but then they put it out finally.
They did put it out, yeah, and you can buy it as a graphic novel still. It's a great anthology, beautiful story. But I think by the time my issue came out, anyone who bought the first 2 issues or whatever it was had totally forgotten the series existed. But the graphic novel is great. I believe it's called The Dream Corridor. So much amazing talent on it. Here's a story where I convinced a fellow artist of mine, a guy who's a little bit older than me, to model for one of the characters, and they're fighting inside. It was the Silver Corridor is considered the first virtual reality story. So they're jumping from reality to reality. 2 people are jumping from reality to reality, fighting each other in each reality. And when they're between realities, jumping from far future space to medieval king to things like that, they're mostly naked except for a loincloth. And they're supposed to be old men. So I had an older artist friend model for me for the body, because I had no idea at the age of about 25 or 26 what an old man body looked like doing things. So he was really kind to do that, posing for me in his underwear. He had a bit of a gut. And then he wasn't a guy I hung out with on a regular basis. So my comic shop owner told me for years, every few months that guy comes in asking, hey, is Dream Corridor out? And I have to tell him no. And I'm just thinking to myself, I hope he really believes that I was shooting photographs of him in his underwear for a comic book story, because otherwise he's just going to think I had a really weird fetish.
I wonder if the comic shop owner said no, or if he said no idea what you're talking about. Because no would mean he knows of the project and it's just not out yet. And therefore saving your reputation.
I was living in Bloomington, Indiana. It's a relatively, it's like 50,000 people or something like that. So everyone in the comics community knew each other. And he knew I was working on that. And but yeah, it was just, it began getting kind of weird for the guy. Just oh, okay, I'm going to finally get the reward for having posed in my underwear with all these, doing awkward poses and stuff like that, and blah, 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 and hot lights. And yeah, I hope you got to see it someday.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hope he finally got his copy.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your artistic style, and specifically how you came to feel confident in it, or if you don't, if it's ever evolving. As we said, you broke in pretty directly into DC with the Green Lantern issue. How long do you think it took on working on various titles and books before you felt comfortable in what you were doing and you felt like you were okay, this is what a Gene Ha book or art is going to look like?
See, I have a lot of admiration for people who are very confident doing a very graphic style. Like one of my favorite cover artists of all time is Dave Johnson, who's just brilliant at doing things simpler and simpler and being pure to the black and white inkiness of it all.
Right.
But my vision in my head of the reality I'm trying to get onto the paper has always been kind of either complexly grayscale, like a black and white movie, or sometimes patches of color, or for full color, complex full color, like an oil painting. And trying to get this on the page, especially during an era before Photoshop, which is when I was coming up, or before I had access to Photoshop, was really, really hard when you had to mail in original pages that got, high contrast black and white photographed for print. And it was this constant battle of I started off trying to do kind of a Barry Windsor Smith cross-hatching style with big inky shading, but that didn't really represent what was in my head. And it was hard for inkers to translate what I was doing into the type of shading I wanted, where there was often some very subtle gradations. And then I began taking over more and more of the inks. And I would sometimes ink the figures and leave the rest for them, the backgrounds for them to ink. They'd still get paid the same, and I would only be paid for the pencils, but there you go. And then by the time I got to the Archie Goodwin and the Harlan Ellison stories, I was just doing all the inks myself. But when you do this, the cross-hatching got so fine that it looked a little bit like the cross-hatching on a dollar bill. Which is really hard to color. Really hard to do that well. And in the 90s, um, I was going to say this might insult the colorists I know out there, but the colorists who survived the 90s were the really great ones. This was the dark ages of American comic book coloring. It was the worst. And just like if you knew Photoshop, but you didn't understand color theory, you could still get a job coloring sometimes. So it was not a good matchup. And then I slowly began figuring out different ways to take over the color. And that's how I got to my Starman and the Shade stories, again with Archie Goodwin and Chuck Kim, assistant editor, where I was doing warm and cool grays as what I called a shading guide for the colorist. And then that got sent to the colorist, who then translated into art. And I've heard sometimes they just scanned it.
Wow.
Yeah. But again, I was only being paid for the inks, for the pencils and inks.
Right. Yeah. You
So
didn't get the color credit.
No, and I shouldn't have. I mean, it's still, in theory, you need a colorist to really translate it.
Sure.
But it was a lot of extra work for no glory and no pay. So that's kind of who I am, where I've been constantly fighting to try to figure out how to get my vision onto the page. And then I finally got Photoshop, but I'm not fast at coloring. So then it's a matter of fighting against how slow I am to get my vision on the page. So there you go.
I see.
Yeah.
So, but you're slowly or maybe more quickly now getting more and more control over sort of the final product.
Yeah. I like doing covers because then I can, the deadline's not as harsh, you know, where you have to maintain almost a page per day rate.
Right.
So I can take more time on it, get the color exactly where I want it. Or I can work directly with one colorist. See, there's a problem with a lot of working through a lot of comic book companies, because the editorial office likes to hire all the freelancers and control the communication between them. So therefore, it's hard to communicate directly with everyone else on the team unless you're going behind the backs of the editor. But nowadays, it's a little easier for me because I'm usually doing creator-controlled projects, or if they convince me to go on a thing, I say, if I'm going in, I want my team with me. And therefore it's a colorist I know, and I know how to communicate with, and things like that. So things have gotten a lot better. And of course, we're no longer, for like the last for this whole millennium, we have not been inside the dark ages of comic book coloring anymore.
That's true. One of your bigger projects that you're most well known for rather, and sort of, I guess, in the transition from the dark period to the light, as it were, with Photoshop and all of those production tools, is Top 10.
Yes.
And that was a book you did with Alan Moore, originally a 12-issue series. I believe, was it 99 that it started?
About then, yeah. It might have been 98, but I think it actually came out in 99. It was one of those weird date cover, versus release date things.
So I'm wondering, we just talked to, I guess, a compatriot of yours, J.H. Williams III, who did Promethea.
Yes.
Also America's Best Comics series. How did this all come about? How did you get hooked up with the very unknown Alan Moore?
Oh man. Okay, so this is gonna be a lot of name dropping here. So
name drop away.
Okay, so at the time I was friends with Alex Ross, and he was doing covers for Supreme at Awesome Comics. So a Rob Liefeld project. So just some of the most beautiful work he's ever done. And they were written by Alan Moore. And I told him, I'm really jealous you get to work with Alan Moore. Talked to him on the phone. He said, well, Gene, if you want to work with him, why don't you try to get a project with him? And I was like, well, yeah, I guess I should. So that's finally, that little kick in the butt finally got me trying to track down Alan Moore's career and get a job on one of his projects. So I contacted Rob Liefeld's Awesome Press, which collapsed before I got a chance to actually do anything at that point. It came back in another form, but that was the end of that trail. And then Alan moved to Wildstorm, which was an independent sub-label of Image at that point, under Jim Lee. And then I contacted the editor there who's going to be doing this, Scott Dunbear, who knew who I was, but Alan Moore did not know who I was. So I sent in samples for Scott Dunbier to forward to Alan Moore. Alan liked them. And then I got to find out about what the line was going to be at America's Best Comics, which included Promethea and Top 10 and all that. And I got to read the pitches for each of these series. And I thought to myself, ooh, that Promethea one sounds amazing. That would be fun to draw. I really hope they don't assign me Top 10 because that'll be really hard to draw. That's a lot of buildings. But they made the right call because I could not have done what J.H. Williams did. That Jim's work on that is just, it was doing a kind of like a religious text designed to be symbolically interpreted at every level. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of pages where you could do numerology on just the dialogue or the signs in the background. It would mean something significant because Alan's that crazy.
I was telling him, even besides that level, that just from the pure layout level, that I had to stop reading it on the subway because I'm turning my book this way and that with circular and spiral type layouts and things like that. People looking at me like I'm crazy.
Oh man. Yeah. I mean, again, also the artwork was designed to be looked at as religious iconography, like a mural inside of an ancient temple or something like that, or a tarot card. So yeah, I could not have done what he did. I should also mention I got to draw Promethea before J.H. Williams finalized the design. And you can, if you look really hard online or at a collectible, someplace that has amazing collectibles, you can find the poster I drew with not Promethea.
Oh, interesting.
And the design is so boring and Xena Warrior Princess. I am amazed that J.H. Williams has never come up to me and made fun of me for that designing that costume. The one good thing I did is I designed her staff, the distaff.
Ah,
which
that's a very cool part.
Yeah, that's the only thing that's derived from that design.
Okay, this is how artistic development works. I think it's iterations.
Well, the funny also another thing is J.H. Williams designed a series of brilliant costumes for Promethea.
True.
Yeah, and so it's like, and all of them are better than mine.
Well, I think you're being modest. I'm
no,
sure.
No. My costume was predictable, and all of his were really good. Especially like the later ones that got better and better. So he's like, when he began really getting a feel for the character or where he wanted to go, it's just like, oh my God, these are so great. There are some great costume designs for her.
You had to do a lot of inventing in terms of costume design on Top 10. I mean,
oh yeah. For anyone who hasn't read Top 10, it's a city where everyone is a comic book character, essentially, mostly superhero characters. And all of the police are pretty much various forms of wacky, multiversal, alien and human and robotic police with superpowers. Right. So if you see a hot dog vendor, pretty good odds it's going to be an old fat man with heat vision or something like that. Pizza delivery kids who can run faster than the speed of light and such. So yeah, it's just, and almost all of the costumes, unless you're really rich, look really crappy. I was very inspired by Ma Hunkel, the original Red Tornado, who's wearing red long underwear and a pot on her head with 2 eye holes cut out through it.
I mean, still a classic design.
Oh yeah, but I wanted most of the people on the street to look like that.
Yeah, I think you succeeded in the best way possible by making them look like that.
Yeah, and none of them had to look as elegant as Promethea.
That's true. So how did that work in terms of working or collaborating with Alan Moore, who's known for his detailed scripts, and yet I would hope you had some element of creative freedom. If he said, there's going to be a hot dog vendor, you say, well, it's going to be, have a pot belly and laser eyes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the amount of detail I draw in a story varies depending on the needs of the story. And this is not even the story of a police precinct. It's a story of a city and the city they live in. The cities have real big character in it. And the cities, as much as it's both about being overbuilt to an insane extent, where essentially Neapolis, the city where this takes place, is a Manhattan with a futuristic Manhattan built on top of it, with 3 more futuristic Manhattans built on top of that, getting more and more sci-fi future as you go higher in the levels, and more expensive as real estate. So in any direction you look, it's going to tend to be full of buildings in every view, all the way through the distance. So unless you're looking at a nearby storefront blocking your view, the density just gets worse and worse. And then you can keep on filling crowds in the street in the background. You want to try to make them references to something. But I should mention the freedom that Alan Moore gave all of his teams is saying early on in the script, everything, except for the obvious main characters and dialogues and stuff like that, all the background detail suggestions are just suggestions. And you have the freedom to do as you see best. And I am and was a huge Alan Moore fanboy.
Mhm.
So I was a little afraid to diverge from the script, but fortunately early on, by page 13 of issue 1, I brought on Xander Cannon, who unlike me hadn't just been an artist, but not writer in comics. He had written, drawn, published, lettered his own comics over time for years by the time I met him. And he had some analytical skills on scripts and story and how it works that I didn't as a mirror artist. So he would explain, okay, so Alan's doing this here for this reason, he's doing this here for this reason, he's throwing all this detail in here, but it'd actually be more useful to, as long as we establish it in the first panel, we don't have to keep on drawing it again in the next panel, or we can wait to do the exposition for that till panel 4 or something like that. So he would play around with it in a really creative way to make sure that he always caught the spirit of the story, and occasionally, sometimes, sparing me much misery. So he was doing layouts by the time we got to issue 2, and he was very fast to lay out and very smart about it. And also, this is really crucial for all you kids out there who want to become artists when you grow up and by the age of 52 or something like that. Xander also made sure that he doodled in the word balloons with all the dialogue in it, the speech bubbles, so I knew how much space the dialogue would take up approximately.
Wow.
And I might change the exact layout of where the figures and backgrounds went inside each of the panels, but I never changed. I don't think I ever changed the shape of the panel he drew and the shape of the dialogue he drew. I would fit it around there differently, but make sure that it fit.
That sounds like just an amazingly hand in glove sort of collaboration.
It started off a lot rougher though in issue 1, where we weren't sure we'd never worked as a collaboration like that before. So we traded off with like, okay, Xander, do you want to try finishes on this page? He's like, sure. And then his style was rougher than mine. Or I try to do layouts and I would do layouts for him and be like, well, that didn't make any sense. It took us a few pages to figure that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but by issue 2, it was really clear Xander is a genius at and much faster at doing layouts and storytelling, and I can draw a level of detail that Xander should never subject himself to for good reasons of mental health and all those other reasons too. So
do you in terms of that level of detail, is that something you just sort of naturally feel like you have to do, or is it just like part of like your artistic sort of approach, or is it really kind of you feel like each project needs this kind of level of detail?
No, it's the needs of the story. So certain stories need extra detail and others don't. And I will tend to throw in more detail than other people, but if the story doesn't need a lot of detail, I'm not going to throw in that much detail if I can help it.
Right.
Let me see. Okay, so I'm going to show you a preview of something that has not been released or announced totally yet. I'm doing a fundraising anthology. It's a take what you will from this. It's a story about a turtle who's based on Mitch McConnell. So you can see the level of detail in this scene here. That's me drawing that.
Wow.
And because it's for a nonprofit anthology and stuff like that, yeah, I didn't feel like I had to draw crazy details in all the backgrounds. And this is really going to give away some of the game here. Let's see. Here's some Supreme Court justices. On those scenes, these are essentially trading card images.
Mm-hmm.
um, kind of explaining, like almost like baseball card, explaining who each various conservative Supreme Court justices are.
Right.
And for that one scene, I want it to be realistic, but for the rest, I want it to be cartoony and kind of feel like a Walt Kelly Pogo comic.
I was just going to reference that in that first image.
Yeah. So it's the need of the story.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Soon after, or around that same time that you're doing top 10, you also take on your first writing gig, which again seems like an organic extension, of wanting to make your work be sort of control different facets of the output, and that was with a Marvel Knights issue.
Yes.
Was that something you always wanted to do?
The thing I always said back then was that I always want to work with the best writer I can get to work with, and so far that's never been me. And what happened with that one is, I'm not going to name names, but I was got a chance to work with a writer I really wanted to work with for that anthology short story, and then when the deadline came for the script to start coming in, the writer stopped contacting the editor through telephone and email.
Ghosted.
And yes, and Stuart Moore, the editor, said, "Well, Gene, you're the last man standing. You're going to have to write the story." And I was like, warned him, I've never formally written a story before, but I am overconfident that I can. He said, "Go to it, Gene." And I am grateful to him for this. That he's another one of the great mentors of my life, because I had to go through 5 drafts of a short story before he finally said, "Okay, it's ready. Go ahead and draw it." And he had to explain to me the flaws in the story multiple times. He had to help me fix the story over and over and over again. It must have been excruciating. And just saying, "Okay, are you looking at this from the villain's point of view? Why is the villain doing this? Does it make any sense that the villain's doing this? Or is he just doing it to give the hero, so you can give the hero something to do?" And it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. The villain has a goal, and if he isn't consistent to his goal, the story doesn't make sense. Or are you looking at this from the victim's point of view? There's a moral outrage here and stuff like that? Are you looking at this from a hero? It was a Iron Fist story. He was, he grew up lived in a monastery for a while and accepted all their philosophies. A moral outrage has happened. Why isn't he angrier about it, or trying to stop it a little bit harder, or trying to stand against it and just bypassing it? He needs to stop here and do something about it. And he took me through the story again, 5 drafts, and taught me how to look at a story as a writer. And the thing is, as critics, everyone is kind of ready to be a comic book critic, because we all know what we like, and we can kind of explain why something doesn't make us happy or it does make us happy. But it tends to be very monocular, just a one-eyed view of it. And it's that famous thing of Roger Ebert getting to write his first movie script. It was The Valley of the Dolls, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Yep.
And it was life-changing for him, because he finally got to see how many things can make a script be a bad script. And in his case, it actually got turned into a pretty bad movie. And it gave him a lot more empathy for the whole writing process, which is what happened to me too. I went through my little Roger Ebert Beyond the Valley of the Dolls experience, having Stuart Moore, thank you, Stuart, show me what I did not know.
And so it sounds to me like that experience would have maybe put off other folks from, writing again. What did you think after you were done with it? Did you say, that was difficult, but I want to do more of it? Or do you say, that wasn't my speed? It was good for once, but
I still held the philosophy. I want to be, work with the best writer I can work with. But I did know that storytelling was my job. And if I didn't understand writing, I'll also remember Xander Cannon explaining to me as a fellow artist the things I didn't know about how scripts work, or how stories work, or beats work, or how placement of characters on even a panel sometimes could change, or word blues in a panel can just totally change the nature of a story. Finding out that these two experiences close to each other really showed me that if I want to be a better artist, I need to learn more about writing. So I just kind of dove into it. I became obsessed with DVD commentary tracks. When you kids may not know what those things are, but they were amazing. yeah, you could watch a whole TV season, and then oftentimes the writer or showrunner or some of the actors would explain all of their creative choices as they came up in the story. Again, reading books on writing, and just I did not do the crucial thing that people say that writers need to do to learn to write, which is write every day, because I was drawing every day. But I was starting to absorb the lessons and stuff like that.
Good.
Yeah.
And that is a great, I think, segue to your creator-owned property, May.
Yes. In which I had another experience where there's a writer I wanted to work with, and then the project fell apart, and the writer did not show up, and I had to figure out what I was going to do. And it's like, well, that project's dead, and I have a little bit of spare empty time in my hand, which I can fill with anything. And there's been some characters I've been doodling. Maybe this is my chance to finally draw them. And that's how I started on that.
So it came out of, it wasn't, say, a long gestating project, something from your notebooks in the 90s, or was it?
It was from my notebooks from the early 2000s, and I didn't really get serious with it until about 2013. And there's a thing that I kept on seeing things on TV. I'll mention 24 and as like a really good example of this.
Right.
That at the time, there were not a lot of female geeks inside of adventure stories who are heroes, who are the heroes of the story, or who got things done. They tended to be a woman on the other end of the hero's headset giving advice to the hero on which cables to cut, or how to get past the door, or stuff like that, or hacking stuff, and then suddenly miracles happen. Problems disappear for the hero. The other way that female geeks tended to appear in popular culture at the time was the whole geeky girl who's really gorgeous but is wearing glasses, gets her glasses taken off, and then a guy says, "Oh my God, without your glasses on, you're gorgeous. You're not a geek."
Yeah.
And then the girl goes, "Oh, thank God I don't have to be a geek anymore. I will give up every intellectual pursuit I've ever had. I, Rory Gilmore, promise this."
The manic pixie dream girl is how it was always described.
Oh yeah, but some manic pixie dream girls, well, they emotionally crash, but they're not necessarily like smart geeks.
True.
And they don't necessarily change that much that way. They're just, anyway. Yeah, I wanted a character who is female and a hero because she is a geek, which I didn't see a lot. And there's now plenty of those characters now, but when I started, that was not the case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it was a great execution of that vision.
Yeah, but let me just throw this in also. It's not so much that I thought this was a principle where, like, oh my God, we should have female geeks as characters, because in principle there should be these characters. It was because I had so many friends who are female geeks. I'm sure you do too.
Yes.
And it's like, wow, why don't I see any characters who are like my friends? There should be a story about these people.
Yes, there should be multiple stories
about
these people, which again you were doing, and now others have picked up the thread as well, which is great.
Yeah, and yeah, I think it was just this tidal wave that was coming. I mean, I feel like I think all of us kind of came to it independently. I don't know if anybody was inspired to do this because of me,
right?
But yeah.
And why Kickstarter? How did you get the idea to do that? Although I know there's sort of Dark Horse was also kind of involved. Maybe you can talk about the sequence of that, and now it's at Oni.
I had a lot of friends who were doing Kickstarters at the time. I wanted to own the property. I didn't want to have someone, a company, to be able to take it away from me. So, like, I mean, I've never had much of a goal of I want to create characters for Marvel to own or for DC to own or something like that. I mean, I will if it's part of a story or something like that, but that's not a goal of mine. And I don't have things in my pocket where it's like, oh, I want to like make a Hulk, a Hulk supporting character that everyone will love. I want to tell my own stories. So part of the reason I did so I started off as organizing as Kickstarter. Dark Horse did get interest before the Kickstarter had launched, but I wanted to make sure I did it as Kickstarter first to establish this is a character I own, both legally and just in the public perception, and for myself.
Yeah.
And I still own that character, and Dark Horse did not turn out to be a good fit for the character, so I am so grateful it didn't happen that way. I should also mention I'd seen so many people burned by not owning their characters. There's a whole wave of it happened with Tokyo Pop,
Hmm.
where mid 2000s, Tokyo Pop came out, offered all these new brilliant young creators a chance to put out their dream project if they signed away all the rights to it. And a lot of these creators to this day cannot draw their dream project anymore.
Ugh.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's tragic.
Yeah. Also, if you know looks like the name of this company is called Comico, but it's Comico.
Yes.
Yeah, where Shelley Bond
Familiar.
started off, and the Elemental. Yeah, a lot of those books also. The company owned it. The creators poured their hearts into it, and to this day, they still cannot draw those stories.
Oh. Man, that's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah,
I have to say. Well, back to your positive story.
Yeah.
With May, do you consider this an ongoing series? I mean, there have been you had a sort of a May 2.
Yeah.
I know you're still working with Oni, presumably.
Oh, okay. If you look at my Twitter handle at the moment this interview is going on, I don't know when you're going to be watching this, future viewer.
Yes, future viewer.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is currently Gene Haas working on a secret project. So that is not me. But I will say the project I want to do after the secret project is May. And my my current publisher, Oni Lionforge, wants to do the 3rd volume. And it's plotted out. It's not dialogued yet, so it's not a full script. I haven't drawn, and also the story roughs is the point where I consider it a real living, breathing story before I get the finished art done. Once I do story roughs with shading, line work, panels, lettering, and all that type of stuff. So all the dialogue. At that point, it's a readable comic book, and that's when I consider it a finished. The story is real.
Right.
When I get to that stage, that's there. So it's not there yet, but I am really eager to do it, and I have Oni willing to back me, and I've got some ideas on how I might do it, but I'm not totally sure yet. I'm gonna have to run it past friends who are smarter about business than I am. I am not a businessman.
Well, I am happy to hear that is an iron in the fire. We'll
Yes.
call it that. And I wonder if you approach this as sort of a story by story kind of thing. Do you think in other words, do you think you'll always be doing May in some shape or form? Or is it, do you have sort of a finite number of stories that you feel like you can tell and it'll come to a conclusion?
The 3rd volume will bring it, will tie up most of the plot threads. It won't cut them off and destroy them forever or anything like that, but it'll tie up all of the major plot threads I've been building up, and it's everything I've been planning on building it up to. Where if you read volume 1 and volume 2, you'll see it starts off kind of as a variation on a Narnia or Oz type fantasy story. And then as it goes by, it gets a little more Jack Kirby-esque. And I want to keep the roots where it's the story structure, frankly, is very much tied into the identical story structure Tolkien used for The Hobbit and for The Lord of the Rings. The structures are really similar in those 2 stories, even though one's much different length. And I stole that structure to start off May, and it's building up to its Return of the King. And I had plans all along for how I wanted to get, and my Return of the King is very Jack Kirby, but it's still the same characters building up through their continuing story arcs and character arcs, but dealing with things that are really new gods big.
You've really undersold it here, mentioning Tolkien and Jack Kirby in the same breath. I think this sounds very minimal, very
Oh, I'm going to throw
very
out some more.
simple and
Okay. I'm going to throw out some advice out there for aspiring creators. So I've met so many young writers and young artists who want to do a comic book, who want to do an epic. And their plan is they've been doodling ideas for the first 20 pages of their 500-page epic. And they don't know how to get this thing out the door. And the advice from me is always the same. Tell a short story inside that world. And if that 4, 5, 10-page short story is interesting, then you know you have something. If you can't make it interesting in 10 pages without 9 pages exposition and then 1 page of interesting story, you don't have something. It's never going to work.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. And if you look at a lot of stories, they're built up as chapter books. I mean, literally the way that Charles Dickens did his stories, where he released an episodic story once per week or so inside of a London newspaper. And then each of these chapters got compiled at the end with some editing into an actual novel. And you'll see this is true in a lot of books. Brad Meltzer books. If you ever read a Brad Meltzer book,
Right. Yeah.
it tends to be like 2 to 5 page chapters, very fast paced with a sudden ending. And it's like, oh my God, this is like, it's a Dickens chapter book.
Yeah.
And it works really beautifully. So just keep on building up the short stories that connect to each other in a way that it forms a novel. But each chapter, if you're doing that method, each chapter has to be interesting on its own.
Sure. I mean, that's, that's the serial storytelling way. I mean, that's what made, the episodic ongoing comic really sing, was to tell a complete story in issue, but have a cliffhanger at the end. So you want to come back, and also have some little threads going throughout that may, be picked up on later. So
yeah. Oh, I'm gonna give you some advice that one of my great mentors, Xander Cannon, gave me, which I've repeated to him literally decades later, and he says, I don't remember saying that, but it's true. On every page needs to be interesting on its own in a comic book.
Right.
Something interesting should happen that changes the nature of the story, where if you took it out, the story wouldn't work anymore. So
Wow.
every page, make it interesting, make it a little bit almost like a Sunday strip, where it tells its own little story and then builds up to bigger chapters, almost like, again, mini chapters inside of this a small book.
The bigger chapter. I wish
and if you can see
people
this,
would take that advice. Actually, I mean, I think we're getting away from it now a little bit, but there's a time period more recently, and maybe we're still in it, where I think the bloat has sort of taken over storytelling, particularly in comic books.
Yeah.
Where, I guess they call it decompression, right? So, in order to fill out a trade paperback, things maybe on a page to page basis are not going on.
Yeah.
In that same way.
Yeah. There's if you're doing a page of exposition, ideally you want to figure out a way that it advances the story and it doesn't feel like you're doing exposition.
Right.
But if it's a 9-panel grid of fact, here's 9 facts on 9 grids, and there's something entertaining happening in it, it kind of failed.
Yeah.
Some people can do this beautifully, and some people can't. I'm going to mention, like I mentioned before, Komiko and Bill Willingham, and one of his amazing qualities as a writer is that he's able to do, in person and in comics, he's able to do exposition in a way where it's just exposition by itself is fascinating. But not many other writers, it's an uncommon quality among writers. Usually you have to really jam in the story to make it work. And I think he kind of does that in a way which I don't see other people doing, and I don't understand how he does it. But yeah, most mere mortals, please keep the story going and keep the exposition subtle.
Yes. The folks that break the rules and get away with it and are lauded for it are few and far between. Better to hew to this advice from Xander and yourself. I'd say. Yeah. Not being creative myself, it just sounds really good, and I think it's probably, if I analyze my reading habits as well, those are the sort of story approaches that I would gravitate to as well.
Oh, wait a minute. Somebody else who can do exposition in a way I can't. Kelly Sue DeConnick, especially look at another project I've done recently, Wonder Woman Historia #1 with Phil Jimenez and Kelly Sue DeConnick. And they do have like double page spreads, which are pure exposition of here's 6 goddesses.
Right.
But they're both so good at it. And then I got to repeat that, but I had the template set up by Phil, so it's pretty easy. And I had dialogue, of course, by Kelly Sue DeConnick, but yeah, it's making that as interesting as they do is really hard.
I was going to ask about that project. So yeah, it sounds it sounds really interesting. I've not had a chance to check it out, but so what is the basic gist of Wonder Woman Historia?
Okay, so Wonder Woman Historia is the history of the Amazons before the birth of Princess Diana. So And if I imagined like, how are you going to tell the history of the Amazons again, I'd probably tell it from a human level and then build it up.
Right.
And Kelly Sue DeConnick is the crazy genius who said, I'm going to do the exact opposite, and it works. It's amazing. She tells the story from the viewpoint of the gods, and then at the very end of volume 1 with Phil Jimenez, finally brings it back to humanity. And they just show this emotional turmoil and rage among the female gods at the injustices of the world against human females. And then they make this clever, dangerous plot to change the world. And then at the end of all that, like the last third of the book shows how this crazy plot, because Zeus is a dangerous, crazy man. They show how the crazy plot by the female Olympian gods then affects people on Earth and starts putting things in motion. And it's just brilliant, and it's heartbreaking, and it's full of exposition, which is actually visually and just as comic story, as pure visuals and as comic storytelling, is just so much fun and so huge and epic and heartbreaking. It's just, there's nothing else like it. And yeah, it's Eisner winning book. It's brilliant.
Was this world always something you wanted to do, or did it just kind of fall in your lap? Were you always a Wonder Woman or Greek mythology type person?
I've always been a Greek mythology person since I was a little kid, because I was a Dungeons and Dragons kid, and there were Greek monsters inside of the monster manual. So I read a lot of Bullfinch's mythology and other books they had in school libraries about the Greek myths. But the books they make available in a school library about Greek myths won't tell the interesting stories necessarily, which get really creepy and weird, which have, instead of offering moral lessons, they offer immoral lessons, because Zeus, again, is a horrible, horrible person, and a lot of the other gods are too. Yeah, so Kelly Sue knows all of it. She was like dropping little, in the script for me, she was dropping little bits of wisdom of like, and we're basing on this story here, or this reference to this story. And it's kind of like, I never heard of that version of that myth. Or I thought that one had a happy ending. Oh, no. And it's just like, oh, so I should mention how this dropped in my lap though. So to this day, I've never physically met Kelly Sue DeConnick. So before the pandemic started, yeah. Oh, she is a delightful person to talk to on the phone, or Zoom with, or email with. She's just so much fun, and I hope she's at least as much fun in person. But yeah, what happened is I went to Heroes Con. I got a ride, a shuttle from the airport to the hotel with a stranger, and that stranger turned out to be her husband.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah. And then he came up to me the next day in breakfast after he realized, oh, Gene Haas here, and said, you know what, my wife would like to do a project with you. And I was like, oh, she's written some really great books. She's one of those writers I'd like to work with someday. Sure. She is near the top of the class of people who can write better than Gene Ha that Gene Ha wants to work with. So that's how that got by. And knowing almost nothing about what the project was, I mean, he explained a little bit to me. I just said, just Kelly Sue DeConnick, I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Why wouldn't you? Yeah, that's a total like jump on as soon as the invitation is made. So I know we've gone quite a while here. I had just a couple more questions. One was, since we're back in sort of the realm of, I was going to say other people's properties, OPP, but the non-creators own stuff. I was wondering if there are characters or books that, in the grand arc of things, I know you want to continue to work on your own stuff, but that you would jump at the chance to be on.
There's a thing, frankly, where by the first 5 years of my career, I pretty much worked on any character I really wanted to work with or work on. And after that point, it was just like this, it was just this kind of wonderland of just like, if you can imagine being an actor in demand in 1940s Hollywood, and who's a cinemaphile and a big fan of brilliant directors, and you're in this urban, this metro area where you're surrounded by brilliant directors, and a lot of them want to work with you. that's way more attractive than any particular script or character or franchise. It's just like getting to work with a brilliant storyteller like Kelly Sue DeConnick is just too good of an opportunity to pass up. It's just the writers. I love the writers.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense, and I think I would be the same way. Although I come from a writing background, so I would want to co-write, I suppose. Go ahead.
If the writer is excited about a character, that will get me excited about the character. It doesn't matter what the character is.
Yeah.
If somebody's really excited about Brother Power the Geek, which is not a character I'm excited about at the moment, and they're a great writer, I'm gonna love it. You know, if they want to do Limp Boy or something like that from the Legion of Superheroes and have like, I know how to make this story great and to break everyone's heart and inspire everybody with Limp Boy, or I can't remember what it's Bouncing Boy. Sorry, Bouncing Boy. That's what I'm thinking of. With Bouncing Boy. Yeah, I mean, if it's a great writer, I'm gonna trust him and I'm gonna do it.
I always think of Matter Eater Lad.
Oh,
as sort of like, okay, make that guy interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, if they have a take, go for it. All right. So this is a weird one, but your signature, I really like it.
Yeah.
I think, and it's been a while since, I think the classic signatures that people, gravitate towards, like McFarlane and, most of the Image people. And that's partially nostalgic when I grew up. And recognizing it, but I've since that period of time, there hasn't been a lot of recognizable signatures. But yours is great. I love it. How long did it take for you to come up with that and really make it your go-to?
Okay. So I went to an art school, College Creative Studies, where you start off doing graphic design and illustration. And then in second year, you have to decide on a focus, either or art direction. So what happened is that I began reading about the history of graphic design. And there was a graphic designer I read about in one of the library books of the school library named Herb Llewellyn. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And I saw a letterhead he designed. One was for a photographer who had the initials OH. Mm-hmm. And then for his artist agent who had the initials AH. And I looked at this. I'm going to show you the design right now on my phone. That's where I stole it from. Herb Llewellyn. I did not steal it from Adam Hughes, who does his capital also, but no, I just love this design so much. I began signing all my artwork in art school, lowercase HA exclamation mark.
I love it. Yeah, you're not using the same font, by the way. I mean, even if you got the idea from them, I even like sort of the, how you've done it.
I graduated in 1992, so by then 1970s designs were mostly out of favor. So ideally my signature is Berlin Bold. That's the font.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so like the city of Berlin with a G at the end.
Cool stuff. Well, Gene, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this evening, and really love your work. Loved hearing about how all these projects came together. Where can fans and other followers of your work go to continue following that work? Any social media handles, websites, what have you?
If you go to geneha.com, that'll have connections to all the social media I actually stay active on. Let me see. Yeah, that's pretty much all you need to do. But also, I guess the other thing is on Google, I remain the most famous Gene Ha in the world. So, you can also just Google me and see what I'm up to that way too.
Congrats.
Yeah.
That's a big accomplishment.
I will mention, in Korean, my name is Ha Jin. I don't think I'm the most famous Ha Jin in the world, but fortunately I don't go by that name.
Well, there you go. You made the right choice, at least for American Google, I guess.
Thanks, Mom and Dad, for making that my legal name.
Yeah, there you go. You already talked about your, an upcoming secret project, and May beyond that, May 3, the conclusion or the return of the Queen, maybe. Anything else you want to mention in terms of upcoming projects, or anything else we should be on the lookout for?
It's been such a crazy time with like all the logistics snarls and stuff like that for the whole world. So they were supposed to have reissued Top 10 in the spring of this year as a big omnibus. That'll be coming next year. So if you haven't picked up your own copy, because you have to go into buy the old volumes for outrageous prices, next year ask your comic shop to stock up on it for you and get you a copy. Let me see. The third volume of Wonder Woman Historia is coming out. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to get a copy of Historia volume 1 or 2, especially number 1 at this point. But that will be collected into a volume sometime next year. So next year is a very exciting time for me of actually having nice new volumes of stuff, my stuff, or new issues of my stuff coming out. And at some point next year, hopefully we'll also we'll definitely announce what my secret project is, because I'm pretty sure we're not doing this Kickstarter. I'm sure some publishers are going to be very interested.
Lots to look forward to.
Yeah, creator owned, obviously, if you didn't catch the subtext there. So
the hint.
Yeah.
Creator owned. Well, great. We will send everybody your way on the socials and the Googles and the your own site, and definitely be on the lookout for all those projects. Gene Ha, thank you very much for being on Dollar Bin Bandits.
Thanks for a great interview. I'm going to say you asked a lot of questions I literally don't think I've ever been asked before. And
well, that's I'll put that on the back of my book cover.
yeah, I mean, these are stories that are pretty much only told to other comic book creatives like writers and artists. I don't think I've really talked about this stuff in an interview before. So.
Well, I certainly appreciate it. I mean, if you listen to some of our other interviews, I tend to be very interested and dive deeply into the process. I just love the hows and whys of how these things come together. So it's as I said, it was great talking to you, and I appreciate your answering all of these questions that you may have not been asked before, and hopefully everybody else likes it too.
Cool. Well, thanks for listening, everybody, future people.
Welcome back. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode as much as I did listening to it. I'll say it again. Mike did a great job. And you'll hear that I think Gene was actually pretty impressed by the questions Mike asked as well. So yeah, this was a great interview. I love learning about him and his career. And I will say the nipple education was interesting. And in all seriousness, to know that there are standards in the business for things such as that, I find that interesting. There was more, well, we cut it out just, for safety's sake. But that being said, Mike, great job.
Thank you. We didn't talk about this beforehand, but I'm glad to hear that some of the nipple talk, stayed in.
Yes.
Very important to the artwork in these type of genres. So anyway, but it was great pleasure talking to Gene. I would love to have him on again, have Joe and Oren take a crack at his career. He's just such a great, friendly, very accommodating guest, and love his work, and will continue to love his work, and we will highlight that as we go forward in all our socials and wherever. But thank you to Gene Ha. Thank you, Joe, for doing these intros and outros with me.
Hey,
thank you to the listeners and the viewers. We really appreciate your support. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next time. We didn't talk?